next week. Yeah, follow this. Not this semester.
Alrighty, everyone. Good to see you all. So, one, yes, our speaker is not quite here yet, Ashton, but he's on his way. He will be here very soon. So we'll go ahead and get started with announcements because I do have a decent amount. So tonight is our last normal meeting. Next week we do have a meeting, but it's just kind of a fun little party thing. We'll have some board game stuff, probably be ordering pizza, but it will not be in this room. We couldn't get this room, and this room doesn't allow us to have food. So it will be in the SSA 14.245, so same building as our room last semester, not the same room though. It's going to be on the 4th floor, not the 2nd floor. So it'll be in there next week.
There'll be an announcement. We'll
Yes.
we can post a map as well. So
Yeah,
it's a
we'll
different
probably do that. In addition to that, we have shirts. We actually finally have shirts here after so long. So, yay! They're going to be $10 for anyone who wants to come up. Probably afterward, just stop by there and we can figure that out. And I just saw Ashton off the course. Good. Don't know if he's coming.
I'll find him. I'll
Okay.
find him if you forgot where it was exactly.
All right. And so, additionally, we are thinking about possibly changing days that we meet next semester, like next fall, from Thursday to Tuesday, because that seems to work out better for people I've talked to. But
We can go ahead and do
I do
that
not
while
want to
he's
do that
talking.
if it's going to mess up people that are already coming. So,
He's gonna go ahead and set up here while you're
okay.
announcing.
So I will be sending out an announcement in Discord. My phone's already live streaming, so probably right after this meeting is over, I'll send out an announcement with that, and people can vote on just letting us know whether Thursday works better, whether Tuesday works better, whether they both work evenly, or whether neither of them work. But yeah, if we have enough people wanting to do Tuesday, I think it might be better to go there, but I just don't want to mess up everyone's plans. So we'll see. But just possibility that might change.
Configuration here.
So I will go ahead and leave it over to Ashton once he gets everything figured out.
Okay. He's up there. Cool.
All right. So,
I should have brought one. I don't think we have one.
it's all good. So, tonight I want to present about the delay of the Perusia. Jesus delay. Why is it taking 2,000 years for him to return? This is in sort of an objection that doesn't get a lot of attention, and it really bothered me for a long time. So, I devoted a lot of time to studying it, figuring it out, diving deep. So, I wanted to share some of that with you. So, without further ado, let's get into it.
Do you want me to, if you want, I could manually switch slides whenever you point or something like that, if that helps you.
Yeah.
Manual clicker. And scroll.
That works.
All right.
So parousia, that's the Greek word for arrival. That's the term that I've seen a lot of scholars use, so I just used it for these slides. And so the reason this is like somewhat of a pressing issue is because there's a lot of passages in the New Testament where Jesus kind of implies or says explicitly that he's going to return soon. That's really hard to reconcile with, I guess, the time that's elapsed since then. So, yeah, there's three. I guess in this case, there's a few places in Matthew that skeptics like to bring out. A few verses. That'd be Matthew 10:23, 16:28, and 24:34. I don't think we have time to go over all those, but maybe at the end I'll cover those first two. The one we're looking at tonight is Matthew 24:34.
Did several in a row there.
Yeah. So yeah, Matthew 24:34, or Matthew 24 rather, covers the Olivet Discourse. It appears in other passages as well, Mark 13:21, in the Synoptics. And in there, Jesus prophesies the destruction of the temple and when he would return. And so the disciples ask him a very specific question. They ask him, tell us when these things will be, the destruction of the temple, because he just finished talking about that. And then, what will be the sign of your coming in the end of the age? So those two things he wrestles with. So while I was researching for this presentation, I found this video, Satan's Guide to the Bible, which has over 1 million views, and it covers a lot of objections to the Bible, but one of the main ones it covers is the Olivet Discourse, how Jesus said he would return in this generation. In this case, he uses Mark 13:30. Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass until all these things take place. All these things implying not just the destruction of the temple, but also his second coming, his return. So yeah.
Okay. We have the sound set up right here.
So one of the frustrating things about researching this topic is there just wasn't a lot of resources that dealt with this question. Like, did Jesus say he would return in the generation of his disciples? A lot of scholars avoid it, like Michael Heiser, because there's just so much speculation about end times, when that's going to happen. A lot of people look at current events and tie them to Scripture and see the fulfillment of prophecy in their own day. And what Michael Heiser says is, like, these passages, he says, are intentionally ambiguous. And we should just leave the ambiguity where it is, because if God really cared that much, he would have given us a lot more detail, because he doesn't. It's sort of a secondary issue. And while I sympathize with that view, it's kind of frustrating, because it's like, for me, it was a pressing issue. Because it does seem like a contradiction. Like, if we believe that Jesus is the Son of God and he's a prophet, then how do you reconcile that? How do you reconcile the presumably failed prophecy with his divinity? So this is the verse in question. It's the same one as Mark 13:30. Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. Next slide. So let's just get into the passage so we can analyze this a bit better. I don't intend this to be a Bible study, but it is going to require some textual criticism to sort of deal with the objection. So there's 3 sections in Matthew 24. There really isn't 3 sections. I like to divide it up that way because I find it's easier to make sense of. First section is about the destruction of the temple, the tribulation. Jesus calls them birth pains, so like labor pains that happened right before a child is delivered. In this case, that's analogous to the new creation and Jesus' return. And then the second section is about, it's sort of like a middle section. It compares and contrasts the destruction of the temple and coming of and then Jesus' second coming, the coming of the Son of Man. And then finally, the last section is about the coming of the Son of Man. So that's the breakup mostly. Yeah. That's what it looks like. I'll highlight and stuff. But I don't think we have enough time to go through that entire chapter, but I just put it there. Anyway, so next slide. So I'm going to give a quick summary instead of going through that whole chapter. And I put that in parentheses on first reading because there's a lot of readings, a lot of ways you can interpret Matthew 24, but I'm basically going with the preterist interpretation. The preterist interpretation is that everything Jesus talked about when it comes to the destruction of the temple and all that concerned his disciples in the first century. So, yeah, I mean, I think that's the most natural reading and something you would assume on first glance, just looking at that passage. But there are other interpretations. I'm just putting that out there. So, if we just go with that basic assumption, we find that the first section he talks about the time of persecution and general unrest. And then after that, it sort of culminates in the destruction of the temple. It sort of crescendos. That's the kind of image he paints, that everything gets more and more intense, and then the temple is destroyed. And he used the term tribulation for that. And then finally, the Son of Man comes in judgment. So, next slide. So, yeah, so next slide. Oh, that's good. Okay, that's better. That was weird. In there, but yeah. So, all right. So all these things sounds like it would be inclusive of everything here: the intense persecution, the tribulation, and the coming of the Son of Man. And that's really where this objection comes from, because this is what everything Jesus lists or says will happen before saying all these things will take place. So it sounds like all these things Jesus says is inclusive of his return as well. So that's the primary objection we're dealing with. But although this verse gets a lot of attention, there's another verse that I found like arguably even more problematic, that bothered me a lot more. I mean, Matthew 24:29. So before I get Matthew 24:34 and break that one down, I want to touch this verse first, because I feel like unpacking this verse will be really instructive and help us understand like, the passage in general. But the reason this one is more troubling is because Jesus says immediately after the tribulation we establish the destruction of the temple. So he's not giving his disciples a generational timeline anymore. He's saying immediately, as in like no time is passing. So let's dive into that. Yeah, so that's the full verse. Immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, and the stars will fall from heaven. The powers of the heavens will be shaken. That's a very like vivid image. There's some other problems with this, like the fact that stars literally can't fall from the sky. But I think the key to understanding this verse is the language that Jesus uses. And so, next slide. The sun will be darkened, the moon will not give its light, and stars will fall from heaven. This language would have been familiar to Jesus' listeners because it's the kind of language you see all throughout the Old Testament, specifically in apocalyptic literature. So, next slide. So you have a few examples of the same language showing up. That'll be Joel chapter 2, where Joel is prophesying God's judgment on Jerusalem. And the language he uses is that the sun and moon will be darkened, the stars will withdraw their shining. So Joel is written after the exile. So he's talking about a future judgment on Jerusalem. And then you see it in Ezekiel 32. Ezekiel is talking about God's judgment on Egypt. And he also uses the same language is also used there. The sun will be covered with a cloud, the moon will not give its light. And so this kind of like cosmic imagery is common in the Old Testament, and I think it symbolizes God's judgment, but also a kind of symbolic or subjective end of the world. Rather, it's not the end of the world, but the end of the world from the perspective of the people being written about, either Egypt or Jerusalem in this case. And then it also concerns spiritual realities. It's like a common motif in apocalyptic literature. It's really like about pulling the curtains back, so to speak, and it's like God pulling the curtains back and showing us what's going on behind us. It's the more spiritual realities at play. So you see that in Isaiah 14, where Isaiah compares the king of Babylon to a star falling from the heavens. The reason that's significant is because in the ancient Jewish imagination, stars were like angels, basically, or spiritual beings occupying the heavens. And so the stars falling, that's a symbol of these like principalities and powers being cast down from their positions of power or influence over people. So, next slide. So what is an apocalypse? So I kind of use that word, apocalyptic literature. So I'm going to devote some time talking about that. So the apocalyptic genre is like a type of literature in the Old Testament, but also in the Apocrypha and other non-canonical texts, where God is sort of like giving a bird's eye view on human events in history, and it's sort of pulling back the curtain. In Greek, it means revelations. That's where the name for Revelations comes from. And sometimes it's about the end of the world, but mostly it's about the kind of the spiritual realities at play, sort of like undercurrent, undermining human events and driving human will. So, reading Matthew 24 and 29 in light of that, I think it makes sense what Jesus is saying here when he says, the sun will be dark and the moon will not give its light. I don't think he's talking about literal cosmic events happening because, I think people would have noticed that the sun suddenly went dark, the moon went dark. It's not describing a solar eclipse either. And the stars falling from heaven, he's not talking about meteors. I think all this language is describing a kind of subjective end of the world for, in this case, Jerusalem, and God's judgment on Jerusalem in particular. And just for some context, in 70 AD, that's when the Romans besieged Jerusalem and destroyed it as Jesus prophesied, and so that would have occurred 40 years after his ministry, so within a generation. So I think that's what Jesus is describing here instead, not the final judgment, but God's judgment specifically on Jerusalem. Next slide. Okay, and then also another thing to note, the reason this isn't talking about the final judgment, because this language can be used to refer to the final judgment. The reason I don't think it refers to that is because this event happens after the tribulation, so after the destruction of the temple, but before the coming of the Son of Man. So in that case, I don't think it refers to the final judgment. Next slide. So, and also I think there's some strong parallels between Matthew 24 and 24-29 and Joel chapter 2. Yeah, in Joel chapter 2, he's talking about soldiers besieging the city of Jerusalem. I like that quote, that verse at the beginning where he says, "It'll be a great people, their life has never been seen before." It kind of sounds like it's describing Rome. And yeah, so if you want to read it, it's there. But yeah, I mean, it sounds like Jesus is almost appealing to this chapter directly. Next slide. So yeah, reading both these verses, I guess in context. Actually, the reason I include this verse specifically is because it's just to show you that this passage is really complicated. There's a lot more going on here than meets the eye. It's not so simple and obvious at first. In order to understand it, you have to understand, number one, more the Old Testament background, and also the ancient Jewish context that Jesus is teaching. So that's why I think it will help understand Matthew 24:34 as well. Both these verses are part of that middle section I talked about, where Jesus is describing, where he's comparing and contrasting the destruction of Jerusalem and coming of the Son of Man. Sorry. So this is all of Matthew 24:34 in its context. So I'll just read it really quick. Jesus says, "From the fig tree learn its lesson. As soon as the branch becomes tender and puts out its leaves, you know that summer is near. So also when you see all these things, you know that he is near at your gates. Truly I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will not pass away." There's Matthew 23:33. But yeah, so if we're assuming that all these things that Jesus is talking about is inclusive of the Son of Man, we'll have to conclude that, like he said, I think the telling verse is the verse right before that. When you see all these things, you know that he is near. If we substitute the coming of the Son of Man for all these things, you have to conclude that when you see the coming of the Son of Man, next slide, you know that the Son of Man is near. Doesn't quite make sense. Next slide. I think a more logical interpretation is to go with the fig tree analogy that Jesus gives. When you see he says, learn a lesson from the fig tree. When you see its leaves budding, you know that summer is near. And in this case, the leaves is analogous to, next slide, the destruction of Jerusalem, and summer is analogous to the coming of the Son of Man. So I think that's a more logical interpretation than conflating all these things and the coming of the Son of Man. So, not the same. So yeah, I think in that case, the logical conclusion of all these things is this right here. Everything leading up to the coming of the Son of Man, but not the coming of the Son of Man itself. So that's how I respond to that objection. So let's read like the whole middle section in context now. So it begins with saying, like, immediately after the tribulation of those days, the sun will be dark and will not give its light. Then will appear in heaven the sign of the Son of Man. All the tribes of earth will mourn. So they'll see the Son of Man coming, and he'll assemble his elect from all corners of the earth. And then we have the fig tree parable. So let's read that out. First, next slide. We have verse 29 that we went over. Immediately after tribulation of those days, sun will be dark and light. Next slide. Then will appear in heaven the sign of the Son of Man. So he's kind of like holding these two ideas in close juxtaposition to one another. On one hand, you have destruction of Jerusalem and the coming of the Son of Man. And then he explores the connection between these two in the very next paragraph. From the fig tree, learn its lesson. As soon as the branches become tender and put out its leaves, you know that summer is near. So also when you see all these things, you know that he is near at the very end. So I think that one is a pretty easy verse to resolve. But there is one problem with this interpretation. Does anyone see it?
That it does include, it seems like the actual parousia, the actual return within. When you see all these things, the antecedent is not the fig tree's lesson, it is the previous paragraph, it looks like.
Yeah, I think that's where I was going with this. Yeah, like, okay, sure, all these things in the parousia, they're not conflated, they're not equivalent, so to speak, but one, it seems, directly precedes the other. So, next one. Next one. Yeah, he is near, in other words. So when you see all these things, you know that he is near. In other words, one event happens soon after the other. So, okay, Jesus didn't say he would return within a generation, but implicitly it's kind of there. Yeah?
All right. I kind of wonder how literally we should take this. Like, he uses a lot of light imagery, and yeah, he ties it to tangible things like stars, light, heavens, light, a bunch of light imagery. I mean, in another phrase of the Bible, he says, "I am the light," meaning he's the hope, he is the way in order to grow your spiritually. So the fig tree could be a metaphor for spiritual growth. The light could just be another reference to him, like live with me as a role model, right? And when he talks about the end times, it means you're stepping away from him, basically, which is why there's no light. And that's why the destruction is that. So it's more of a distance from God more than it is like a concrete happening event here on earth. And I guess that's why, like, I could see this being very metaphorical versus literal.
Okay. Yeah.
I wanted to add on to that. I also had a similar interpretation, but more that right before it said the powers of heaven, it referred to the stars falling from heaven. So what I interpreted that as was the stars could have been a metaphor for the powers of heaven. So not literally the stars falling from the sky, but more referring to the fall of the powers of heaven.
Yeah, exactly. There's definitely that element there. That's why this passage is hard to interpret. Yeah, when he talks about the stars falling from heaven, he's definitely talking about spiritual realities, but at the same time, he does refer to the coming of the Son of Man, or to the final judgments. I guess that's kind of one of the weaknesses of these slides. I don't really go into the whole passage in depth, but I think there's a lot of context clues to suggest that what Jesus is talking about is the final judgment, his return in power and glory, whatever that looks like. So it's not so much an allegory in that sense.
I was gonna say, well, he couldn't even, and this is a more wider like insight, but like couldn't the final judgment just mean like your passing moments in death?
Yeah.
And your distance from him at that time.
Yeah. Yeah, that's definitely an interpretation I've pondered as well. But in this case, Jesus is talking about a general resurrection of the dead, which happens before the final judgment. That's definitely something he taught. We know that Jesus rose bodily from the dead. And so in that sense, I don't think the judgment is likewise allegorical. It's talking about a literal resurrection of the dead, literal judgment. And also it's connected to human events in human history. Not so much personal events, but the actual physical destruction of the temple, which we know happened. So, but yeah, I mean, those are all good points. I just, how I would respond to that. But yeah, mainly what I want to point out here is that it's implying that he is near. And also, I want to just say this too, like, there's definitely a lot of interpretations, like a lot of ways you can read this passage and interpret it. I'm not, like, my intention here is not to tell you, like, how to read it. I'm telling you how I read it. But it's also just to show you that, like, no matter what interpretation you go with, there are ways to respond to this objection that Jesus is a failed prophet. I'm just showing you one way. But yeah, those are all good points. So yeah, the problem is that he is here, not quite. I wouldn't call 2,000 years near. So, what do we do with this? Next slide. So also when you see all these things, you know, he is near at the very gates. Not only is he near, he's also at the gates, or this is the ESV translation. A better translation is at the door. So about to enter, it's about to walk in and surprise everyone. So next slide. So I think a good way to address this objection is to understand how did early Christians contend with the delay. How did they respond to this? And I think we can get a good insight into that by looking at 2 Peter, where he says that for the Lord, 1 day is 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is like 1 day to him. The Lord is not slow to fulfill his promise, sometimes slowness, but is patient towards you, not wishing that any should perish, but that all should reach repentance. Next slide. So, actually, if you go back. I wasn't supposed to go this far. Can you go back?
Oh, go back to the previous slide?
Yeah. Well, one step forward. Yeah. Okay. So I was actually going to ask. So this is like a common, I guess, apologetic, at least at the time of the first century. But I don't really find it that convincing. But I wanted to ask you all, what do you make of it? Yeah.
Well, I'm just trying to figure out what Peter made of it, because he says that, but then also in Peter, I think he says that the end times are near, and tells us, like, keep a sober mind so that when it comes, like, you can pray. So that seems like really, really soon and imminent. So like he's writing this, but he's also writing that.
Yeah.
I do agree with that, just that the apostles seem to have thought that the coming of the Son of Man was going to be relatively soon.
Yeah.
I mean, you mentioned here 1,000 years. In that time in history, what was the largest number that they knew of? Did they go up to 1 million? Right? Like for their like relative scale, I think I like maybe that was a super big number. Right?
D, C, X,
Yeah, so the Roman numerals, right? Like I can only imagine. So I imagine that was like one of the bigger numbers that they could conceive of.
Yeah.
That the people they're talking to, their audience, could conceive of.
Yeah.
And I think some
So it's
historical
not
adjustments necessary.
Yeah, it's not exactly literal. It's not
Yeah.
literally 1,000 years. Yeah, you're saying.
I forget, but is this person is this directly responding to the accusation that Jesus hasn't returned yet, and that's this is directly in reference to that?
Yeah, I forgot to include that context, but earlier in the passage, she does say, like, in the last days there will be scoffers who will say, where's the promise of his coming? Why hasn't Jesus returned yet? And so directly in response to that objection, this is the conclusion he derives. But
so perhaps it is interesting that he seems to treat it both ways, that it could be a long way away, but it also could be really soon. Is this just saying that, yes, Jesus said it was soon, but this is coming from God. God's version of soon is so far removed from what we can think of that we might as well just consider it happening at any point. Get ready for it. It might happen. It might not.
yeah.
Who knows?
Yeah.
Like, is that the
Were
conclusion
you
you
going
came
to
to?
get into the parable that, like, Jesus would tell the parable about, the people being ready with the lambs.
Like parables.
It's going to be a long time.
That's
Yeah. That's actually where I was going with this. But
Okay,
yeah.
sorry.
Yeah, that's in the later slides. But yeah, I mean, all that is very true. And yeah, definitely in 2 Peter, he talks about the Son of Man coming soon, but there's always that tension, not just in 2 Peter and the writings of Paul, also in Revelations, which is an apocalypse. You also see the same sort of idea, this sort of tension between soon but not yet. And that tension is never really resolved. And yeah, I'm going to go over why. There is that. But yeah, I mean, where I was going with this initially is that this apologetic specifically, that God can take his time, it's on God's timeline, not necessarily on ours, I don't think is that convincing for a skeptically minded person, because number one, it just seems convenient. Number two, next slide. on what basis is he justifying this? Like, it just kind of seems like he's pulling this out of thin air. It's very ad hoc, you know?
Although there was that, what is it, Psalm 90 or whatever written
Yeah.
by Moses that said basically the same kind of 1,000 years like a day kind of thing.
Yeah, so there is an Old Testament precedent for it, but yeah, which I did plan to go into later in the slides. There is that, but it still just kind of seems a little made up. And then last slide, and it doesn't resolve the contradiction. He said near, right? And so it seems like for Peter the main concern is more of a theodicy, like why is God delayed? He's delayed because he's patient towards us, right? It seems like Peter's not really concerned with trying to resolve a logical contradiction with Jesus' own statements. But yeah, so next slide. And so I think the key to understanding this, understanding Peter's point of view and the passage in general, is the conditional nature of prophecy. That's has more to do with, I guess, the Old Testament background that Jesus and his followers were operating in. And so, important thing to understand about prophecy in the Old Testament is that God responds to human action accordingly. He doesn't stick to like hard facts rules, so to speak. No. Next slide. And so one example of this is in Deuteronomy, where he actually gives a conditional prophecy. He says, if you obey the Lord and his commandments, this is Moses speaking to the Israelites, you will be blessed. And then, next slide. However, if you do not obey the Lord, you'll be cursed. So, question is, God is omnipotent, right? So if he knows what's going to happen, why is he, it almost seems like preparing for different outcomes if he knows the future, right? Next slide. That's just something I want you to think about. I do go into it, however. However, the conditional nature of prophecy is not always explicit. God doesn't always specify the condition. If you do this, then this. Sometimes it's implicit. And a good example of that is in Jonah, where in the book of Jonah, where Jonah prophesies the destruction of Nineveh in 40 days, and the people repented, and because of that, God responded to their actions accordingly, and he relented of the disaster that he prepared for them. Yeah, so that's the rest of the passage, but yeah, go on. And then another example is in the Torah, where God tells Moses, I'm going to destroy Israel and start over with you, create a new nation. And then Moses intercedes on Israel, and because of Moses' piety, God relents from the disaster he intended for Israel. It's not like God, or actually I'll go into that later. Next one. And then final verse I think is relevant here is Jeremiah 18. I think this is where this conditional nature of prophecy is explicitly defined, where Jeremiah says that if at any time I pronounce judgment on a nation, and they turn from their ways, I'll relent from it, and vice versa. If I promise blessings, they do evil, I won't bless them. Next slide. So, one thing I do want to note is I don't think that the conditional nature of prophecy implies like open theism, which is sort of a new belief floating around today, which is this idea that God can somehow change his eternal mind. Or that God changes. I don't think God changes, I think people do. I think people are fickle, and the reason God creates provisions, sometimes lays them out explicitly or implicitly in his prophecies, is because he's responding to human action. And because people are messy, sometimes God's plan for salvation also looks a little messy. And so, yeah, and so in other words, conditional prophecies are a form of like divine accommodation. And sometimes they inspire repentance. Because if you know the future, you have the capacity to change it. So sometimes giving a prophecy will indirectly lead to a different course of events. So I think reading 2 Peter in light of that, and of that Old Testament background, makes a lot of sense. Because, yeah, God, in this case, Peter's emphasizing God's patience, right? Why hasn't he returned soon? It's because he's patient towards us. He's accommodating us so that more people can come to repentance. So William Lane Craig actually wrote an article on this, on the delay of the Parousia. The reason he rejects this hypothesis that Jesus' prophecy of his second coming was conditional is because it doesn't really seem like there's any condition. If there is a condition that in other words, influences when Jesus returns, it doesn't have to be explicit, but like it just doesn't seem like there was a condition. It seemed like everything happened exactly the way it was supposed to, and Jesus didn't return. So exactly. So his point is that like it's not likely that Jesus was giving a provisional prophecy, but because nothing really changed, right? God will amend his plans depending on human action, but if people continue going as they're going, there's nothing there to inspire God to change, right? And so like as Jeremiah defined, or as was defined in Jeremiah, God will change his plans, his prophecies, or amend his plans, depending on whether people change. If they change their current trajectory, God will accommodate that. But what's the change here, right? So that's the main objection that Craig brings up. We all love him. We're all here. This flip. But yeah, that is his objection. So that's what I want to deal with too. Like, what is the condition exactly? What didn't change that it's supposed to? And so I think the condition is actually laid out in the previous chapter, right before Matthew 24, right before Jesus goes up to the Mount Olivet. Jesus' Olivet discourse, he tells people in Jerusalem, truly I say to you, you will not see me again until you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. In other words, until they accept him as their Messiah. And we also see this in Romans. I think, in Romans, Paul is basically saying that the Jews have to be grafted back into the family of God, have to accept Jesus as their Messiah before he returns, because he didn't come to condemn Israel. Like, God promised Abraham that he would bless his descendants, not curse them, not judge them so harshly. And so, if Jesus were to return at a more inopportune moment when the when the Jews have rejected him as the Messiah, that wouldn't go well. So, as Paul lays out, it seems like the Jews have to be grafted back in. He uses that image of an olive tree, a branch being grafted back to the tree before Christ returns. And that before then, God has put a partial hardening in Israel. The reason they don't accept him is so that more Gentiles can come in. The ESV uses the fullness of the Gentiles. I think that's kind of a misleading translation. I think a better translation is the full number of the Gentiles. In other words, there's a specific number of Gentiles who need to hear the gospel and accept it before Christ comes, because he doesn't want to return before that number has occurred, whatever that number is. And then there's a second condition. So first condition is that the Jews have to accept Jesus as the Messiah. Second condition is that the gospel has to be proclaimed throughout the whole world. All nations, tongues, people need to hear the gospel first. So, like I just mentioned, and also specifically the maximum number of people. I think that is more analogous to the ancient Christian and Jewish understanding. Yeah, next slide. And I think we see this understanding as well in Second Baruch. So Second Baruch is also an apocalypse. It's written from Baruch's perspective, who was the scribe of Jeremiah. It's part of the Apocrypha. It's not an inspired book, but it's written from Baruch's perspective, and it describes like a vision of the future. A very like language Jesus uses. He uses a lot of cosmic imagery. He uses a lot of very kind of esoteric language. It's not easy to understand, but it's also explained too. In Second Baruch, God is giving this vision to Baruch, and he's telling Baruch exactly what it means. It's about the end times. And main point in Second Baruch is that the final judgment, and the new creation that God promised and all that, resurrection of the dead, cannot happen until a certain number of people have been born, until the earth gives up its full yield, its full fruit. We see that here. Yeah, so it says from the time of Adam, the number of people that God decided would be born was numbered. So he already decided how many people would be born, and that before that number has happened, before that the number of people has been born, that specific number, the end can't come. So, next slide. So I think that explains the second part of 2 Peter, right? That all should reach repentance, right? The reason God is patient is because of the conditional nature of prophecy. And the reason he's patient is so that more people can come to repentance. That's why, in other words, Jesus is delayed. And so the reason I bring up second fruits, I think a lot of the way we should understand Scripture hinges upon how it was understood in its more ancient context, in Jewish context. Next slide. So yeah, I mean that just underscores. Go back one more. Yeah, the kind of ideas that were floating around at the time that ancient Jews and Christians held. Next slide. So is Jesus' prophecy conditional in that case? Can we apply that model, that reason of conditionality to Jesus' prophecy? Is there anything in the text that would imply that his return is conditional? I think the answer is yes. So we have the textual evidence. Jesus gives two parables in Matthew 24 and 25. We were just talking about that earlier. One of them is the wicked servant. The second one is the 10 bridesmaids. Next slide. So the parable of the wicked servant, it's not so much a parable, it's more or less like an analogy. It's like one line. But if that wicked servant says to himself, my master is delayed, and he begins to beat his fellow servants, and eats with the drunkards and masters who come on a day he does not expect, an hour he does not know, cut him to pieces with the hypocrite. So in this case, the Son of Man returns sooner than expected. And then in the next slide, with the parable of the bridesmaids, the Son of Man is delayed. We know he's delayed because in that parable, there's a wedding being held, and it's being held at midnight for some reason, because that's when the groom comes. In this case, the Son of Man, that's what it's analogous for. And so in this case, Jesus is delayed, and and because of that, the bridesmaids, they aren't prepared. So we have two cases in this case. Next slide. In one case, Jesus returns soon, people aren't prepared. In the next case, Jesus returns late, and people aren't prepared. And so Jesus and his disciples, I think, are dealing with an interesting dilemma. How do you expect the unexpected, right? That Jesus can return at any point. And I think that's, I guess, most clearly articulated in Mark 13, which is another parallel chapter, but in that case, Jesus gives an extra parable about a man going on a journey, and then he comes back at a time the servants don't know. And it could be in the evening, or midnight, or the following morning. So in other words, he's affording himself a long time, like a wide range of time to return. And it seems to imply that, yeah, he can return really soon or really late. And so I think that's the takeaway here, is that Jesus is telling his disciples to anticipate an imminent return. In other words, that they should expect him to come soon after the temple's destruction. But there's also a possibility that he's going to be delayed, and to also be prepared in either case, whether he returns sooner or whether he's delayed. But in other words, like, I think the question here is, how do you deal with, or how do you expect the unexpected? I think the answer to that is to expect, like, the worst case scenario. Be prepared for anything. And so if you're prepared for an imminent return and you're constantly vigilant, you'll also be prepared for a delay or for anything, as long as you always keep your guard up. I think that's what Jesus is trying to inspire in his disciples. So that's how I would deal with this objection. Another thing, I did have a part 2 plan, where I actually make a positive case for for Christianity based on just these passages, because I think there's a lot to glean from these passages that actually proves. Oh, go back. Sorry. Yeah, that's a tough line I used. I didn't try to get to that though, because I thought it'd be better if I just like open the forum to you guys so we could have a discussion, and then if there's time, maybe I can go into some of that evidence. But also, I just wanted to mention as well that this is just one interpretation. This is the problem with the preterist interpretation. In other words, if you assume everything Jesus is talking about applied to the people who were listening at the time, people who were alive at that time. There's also a futurist interpretation, which is that everything Jesus talks about, the tribulation, the destruction of the temple, all that applies to some future events that hasn't happened yet. And so if you subscribe to that interpretation, there isn't really an objection. I personally don't find it satisfying. That's why this objection was a big hurdle for me. Yeah.
So, why would, I guess this was a more general question, why would God or Jesus, why would they speak to one segment of humanity, the future humanity? Why would they speak to the present? It seems to me that he would be speaking to all of humanity for all time, because if God is universal and infinite, how could it be any other way?
Yeah, I think we can definitely interpret the scriptures in light of our own time, but I think part of interpreting it, part of understanding it, is understanding the original context it was written in. So I don't think that's really an obstacle to God's omniscience or his deity. I think if you really want to understand it, you understand the Old Testament background as well. I think that's how I respond to it.
I don't want to keep that going, but I was about to go on a tirade about probabilistic universe. I'll let some guys talk about.
Yes.
I'm thinking about, the preterist interpretation of it. I was looking at the language as you were going through this particular passage. And the particular person whose commentary I respect a lot, mostly just because it's this long, interprets this description of this generation, which is in verse 44, Higanea Aute. This generation as to be the generation that is alive in this time when Jesus's explanation of the coming of the Son of Man is taking place. What issues do you find with that understanding?
I think I just imagine what I would think if I were hearing this for the first time. Like if I were a Jew in the first century listening to this, I would say, like it's pretty clear that Jesus is talking about me, right? That I should expect to see all these things, right? And then what I would add to that is I think that's a possible interpretation. I just don't think it's likely. I think it's more obvious that it's referring to the generation of that time. But that's definitely an interpretation that has some historical precedence. That's definitely an interpretation you find among the church fathers, and so it is possible. But yeah.
Kind of on that question about which generation is you're referring to. Another passage that I think is slightly similar to the ones that you're showing here from Matthew is from Luke. I mean, it's a little bit, it's different wording. He could be referring to something else, but in that one he doesn't say anything like this generation. He says, those of you who are listening to this now, some of you will not taste of death before they see the kingdom of God, which could be referring to something else other than like the second coming, but
Do you have that practice?
Luke 9:27.
Oh, nice. Luke 9:27. There's also Matthew 16:28. Yeah.
I was about to say if it's around chapter 9, I might be wrong, but I believe that's Jesus telling that to the disciples, and that is always that conversation in like practically all the Gospels is placed right before the Transfiguration.
It is.
So I've usually heard that as the objection to that claim that the kingdom of God he's referring to is that tribulation that they were able to see, since it was placed immediately after. And of course, I feel like the chapters kind of break it up more in our minds, modern, in our modern Bibles. But I mean, back then it would have just been immediately going into that.
Yeah.
If it was referring to that, though, I just find it weird that he would say some of you will not taste of death. If it's only like a couple days later, then none of them would have died in the interim. I mean, so it's just kind of this strange.
But only a few of them got to see it.
Yeah, but I guess is the some of talking about some of will not taste of death, or some of you will get to see it, but splitting hairs.
Another possibility there was that is Pentecost, and furthermore, I think it's important to recognize like what is Basileia tu Theou, the kingdom of God, Jesus means by that when he says that, which is, I think the best way I've heard it described is that domain in which the will of God is, for his creation, is complied with perfectly. And the intent, of course, and as you see in the early chapters of Acts, is the early Christian church operating in that way such that the will of God is complied with perfectly in this domain that the apostles are living in, and as they're coordinating that based off of what they have learned from Jesus. So in that way, that is as the church was being built under persecution, you see sort of that development, especially, and that makes sense in light of Jesus' descriptions of the kingdom of God as something that grows slowly. So that it's similar, but not, I think, the same. But of course, Ashton, you're talking today, so you get the final say.
The final thing. Did you want to agree with that?
No.
Doesn't mean we have to
it
all
already.
agree.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, keep going.
Yeah.
What are your thoughts?
They turn into a cult leader.
Hey, we already had a talk on that.
I actually really want to get into Luke 9:27. I don't know if it's Luke 9:20. I think it's Mark 9. I think it's Mark. But anyways, we definitely get into that. But I think you had something to say.
Well, just real quick, one challenge for those who would say that Jesus was definitely saying he was going to come back right away is that he also said that he doesn't even know the day or the hour when he'll return.
Yeah.
So it kind of muddies up the waters, but people thinking it's real specific.
That's an excellent point. I wish I included it in the slides. Jesus does say the Son of Man doesn't know the day or the hour, and I think part of that has to do with the conditional nature of prophecy as well. Of course, God the Father knows because he's omniscient, but Jesus, when he was on earth, he had limited knowledge. He was definitely operating within our timeline, in our perspective, and so I think that's why he couldn't give a hard, fast date of when the Son of Man will return, because he hadn't yet descended, and also because human beings are fickle, right? But I think that's another point in favor of that, the conditional nature of prophecy. But yeah, I do want to get into Matthew 16:28. Let me just check our slides where I'm not really was a big game. So yeah, there's a few passages I guess we can get into.
And we probably don't have a lot of time left here.
We have 30 minutes.
Well, we usually have been ending at 8:15, but we can go
Okay.
a little bit beyond that.
Okay, yeah. So let's go over Matthew 16:28 first. Brought up. Don't have my slides for. I don't know if someone has a Bible that they can read.
This is the verse that we were just talking about.
Yeah.
Truly I say to you, there are some standing here who will not taste death until they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. Although at least that's slightly different. This is before the Transfiguration. So the one that you were just talking about.
They're all before the Transfiguration.
Yes, this is right before the Transfiguration.
Yeah, same event. So the reason I don't think it's about Transfiguration is the broader context of that verse. So if you read Matthew 16:24.
I just did. Oh wait,
Sorry,
I'm
yeah.
sorry. I scrolled up and that's why I thought I just read it.
Actually, can I like pull it up
Yeah.
on the screen and then
Do you just
like Google it?
Sure.
you want?
Okay, yeah, let's do that.
Yeah.
Let me just unplug the HDMI and plug it back in.
Yeah, I mean, if you're already on the internet, couldn't you just?
Press escape.
I mean, I could.
Yeah, exactly. Just leave PowerPoint, look it up, and then we'll all see it.
I use Bible Hub. I used Bible Gateway before, but like sometimes the translations are. Then Jesus told his disciples, "If anyone would come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross. Follow me. Whoever would save his life will lose it. Whoever would lose his life for my sake will find it. But will it profit a man if he gains the whole world and forfeits his soul? Or what shall a man give in return for his soul? For the Son of Man is going to come with his angels in the glory of his Father, and he will repay each person according to what he does. Truly I say to you, there are some standing here who will not taste death until they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom." So, if we look at 27, it says the Son of Man coming with his angels in the glory of the Father, and then repaying everyone according to their doing, according to what they have done. That to me sounds like the second coming, and also the final judgment, because everyone's being repaid according to their deeds. So, I think for that reason, the transfiguration isn't likely. Because, yeah, there were no angels in that scene. There was no final judgment. So I think he really is talking about the second coming. But the way I interpret this passage is, or this verse specifically, 28, is in light of 24 through 28. If you read together, there's kind of a structure to it. So if you read the last one, the first verse, 24, then Jesus told the disciples, anyone should come after me, let him deny himself and take up his cross and follow me. And then read 28, it seems like they're connected. Truly I say to you, there are some standing here who will not taste death until they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. I think these two ideas are connected. Anyone picks up his cross and follows me, they will not taste death. So this is an inclusio. Inclusio is like sort of a literary motif in like ancient Greek literature. An inclusio is like a literary sandwich, sort of. It's like you have two verses or two ideas which enclose a main idea. In this case, I think 24 and 28 both parenthesize or enclose the verses in the middle. For whoever would save his life would lose it. For what is the profit of man if he gains the whole world and forfeits his soul? I think those two ideas are sort of the meat of what's being discussed here, and then 28 is just tying all that together. And so, yeah, I would say what's going on here is that 28 isn't an isolated verse, it's not on its own. It's part of a larger idea. This isn't like, three separate ideas strung together. It's one main idea, one complete thought, in other words. And so what's going on here is Jesus is saying, he's basically redefining death, what it means to die. So if you deny him, you will taste death. If you don't deny him, even if you die bodily, he says, like, if you forfeit your life, in other words, or lose your life for his sake, you will find it. So in other words, to die isn't really to die. To die is to deny Jesus. So that's what I think he means when he says, truly I say to you, some of you will not taste death until you see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. He's saying, even if you do die, you haven't really died. And I think there's precedent for that in John chapter 8. Chapter 8. John 8. Then the Jews said to him, now we know you're a demon, because Abraham died as did the prophets. Yet you say, if anyone keeps my word, he will never taste death. And that expression is interesting as well, taste death, because it only occurs once in the Synoptics. And it's in that passage, right before the Transfiguration. You don't find it anywhere else. The only time you find it again is in John's Gospel, and right here. Right? If anyone keeps my word, he will never taste death. So, yeah, that's how I would resolve that objection. I think Jesus in that passage is just redefining death to be a more kind of spiritual death. When he says some of you won't taste death, he's saying some of you will find life, find eternal life. The reason he says some is because, for more context, he's giving this talk in I think Capernaum, which, let me pull up a map. Oh, I'm gonna find the map. No.
You know where to point to it on the map?
Yeah.
You
Is
can
it
bring
the
up the
valley?
map and just kind of point.
The other sea.
Capernaum.
I'm
Yeah,
just trying to see.
it's at the north.
Okay,
Yeah.
there you go.
There it
Yeah.
is.
So here's Capernaum. This is where Matthew 16, that's where it's taking place, is in Capernaum. After this, Jesus and his disciples go up north, far north, you can't see it on this map, to the Mount of Transfiguration, and then they come back down to the other side in Caesarea Philippi, which is over here to the right. It's not listed on this map, because this isn't a great map. Oh my goodness. Yeah, there we go. That's way worse, actually. To Caesarea Philippi, and so let's just go to that chapter. If we go to John chapter 6, John 6, here Jesus is in Caesarea Philippi. Yeah, and he gives his disciples a really weird teaching. He says, "Truly I say to you, if you don't." He says, "I'm the bread of life. If anyone eats of this bread, he will live forever. And that is my flesh." He's basically telling them, "You need to eat my flesh and drink my blood to have eternal life." And yeah, a lot of his disciples were weirded out. And they said, like, yeah, when they heard it, they said, "It's a hard saying, who can listen to it?" And a lot of them just leave. They just walk away, except the 12. And so I think the reason Jesus said some of you will not taste death, or some of you will not taste death, is because he knew in that crowd who would stay and who would leave. So he knew their hearts beforehand. Yeah.
All right, so actually the fact that we're going into the bread of life discourse, and that segues into another thing that I was going to comment earlier. There was this one Catholic theologian, Scott Hahn, who was of the opinion that the real presence of Christ in the Lord's Supper constituted itself constituted a parousia. And the reason he made this argument was in the description of the parousia in the book of Revelation. It culminates with a feast, a wedding feast, the wedding feast of the Lamb, which would have been tied up with the Passover of Christ, and the Catholic doctrine that is perpetuated in the Eucharist, in the Lord's Supper.
Yeah, I know who you're talking about. I have heard that as well. It is a kind of parousia, you can look at it that way.
Yeah.
But I don't think it's the parousia. Yeah, I mean,
And
it's a great point.
when Christ is talking about his immediate coming in passages like the Olivet Discourse, like I would, as a Catholic, I could put stock in the idea that he's referring to that.
I think the context of what the word parousia means is useful too, because so Catholics may maybe use it that way. Dispensationalists would probably also, I would say, misuse it to refer to a rapture, especially in First Thessalonians, when Paul is talking about that, to make it say that people are going to be caught up with Christ in the clouds, meaning, oh, that's the rapture. But that does take out of context what the word parousia actually meant, which is usually this arrival of a king that would be greatly anticipated, and everybody in the city would come out to meet a conquering king, either that was conquering their city that they just surrendered to, or a king that was coming back from a victorious battle. And everybody was celebrating that. You actually see that a little bit in the Apocrypha of, like, Judith has her own parousia in the book of Judith. Not that I'm saying that is scripture, it is apocryphal. But it's sort of, everybody comes out to greet this triumphant king that is coming in. And in that context, it does make sense of an actual return and an establishment of, like, this perfect fulfillment of God's design that we've been talking about.
Oh, good points. This is really interesting.
Yeah. And I think there's a parallel as well in, like, Luke 9, where he describes, Luke says that people expected the Son of Man to return soon, and then Jesus corrects that teaching. He said, no, it's more like a king going out to, like, claim his royal title, and then he returns to the city, yet some of them reject him, and so he puts them to death. That's a symbol for the judgment. But yeah, I mean, there's definitely that motif, but it's more like a triumphant king returning. And so that's why I lean more towards like a literal return, not so much the real presence. But at the same time, there's like so many layers to scripture.
Plus, at the Last Supper, Jesus hadn't left yet. So since his body is still there, physically present, I don't really see how at least the first
first of that.
You know
That's
what, you know what
yeah,
I
I
mean.
know
what-
You know what I mean. I know.
That's a
The
good
first
question for
instant
after
you
the,
should-
for the meeting, because I do want to hear an answer to that.
To the Last Supper.
Or just like what Kevin was just talking about, I would be curious what Alex or anybody else thinks about that after we finish out.
Oh, yeah, afterward. If we do have a few more minutes, there is one more verse I want to go over.
Okay, yeah, just go through it fairly quickly and we'll wrap it up. This is great stuff.
Okay. Yeah, so one last verse I'm going to go over is Matthew 10:23. This is another verse that skeptics use, so I think it also depends on context. Ooh, where are we? Okay. Oh, I guess I did the wrong verse. Where is it?
It's at the bottom half of the year.
No.
23 says you will not go through all the towns of Israel until the Son of Man comes.
Oh, there it is. Yeah, okay. So
That-
this
yeah,
verse-
that
I
does
missed
seem
it.
like
I
the
guess,
right
I
verse.
just had like
I wrote
some
the wrong
weird,
part, sorry.
just like, whatever.
Okay.
Yeah, so 23, yeah, when, I say you will not have gone through all the towns of Israel before the Son of Man comes. So like, this is where Jesus is giving them, not the Great Commission, he's just sort of sending them out, preach the good news. And it sounds like, from the skeptical point of view, that like, he's saying the Son of Man will return. Yeah, that not only they'll see it, but they'll return in their lifetime. But I think this one is a pretty lame objection. I don't know if anyone can see why. If there's any thoughts, and I'll give you my thoughts. How would you resolve this objection?
Wait, what's the objection again?
In 23, it says that he tells his disciples he will not have gone throughout all the towns of Israel before the Son of Man comes. That's something that you could accomplish within a lifetime easily, because Israel's pretty small. It's
This is
pretty
just
short.
something
The
of the
literal
study,
text
too.
says you will not have gone through it all, not that you cannot have gone through it all. So it's,
A lot of
they're simply not going to be, they're going to be persecuted to the point where they're simply not able to.
and many of the apostles ended up dying ultimately outside of Israel.
Yeah. I think the answer to this objection is it's just context. When they persecute you in one town, flee to the next. So he's basically saying you're not going to get a chance to go through all the towns of Israel because you'd be persecuted so heavily.
Or he's right there, he hasn't left yet, because he's sending them out before he even goes to his passion, and they come back before that, so. I
Yeah.
mean, this is a pretty
Before you see the
right
sun.
then sort of thing, and so he's like, I'm gonna probably, coming could be, because if that word is the word that I think that it is, it would make a lot of sense to, yeah, because this can also mean to come or to go or to travel. So that can be to Jerusalem, for, in anticipation of that.
Which word is it?
Erchoming.
Erchom. Okay.
Yeah, I've really heard that one. I don't fully subscribe to it because, yeah, because he says before the Son of Man comes, and it's kind of underwhelming if he's just talking about, hey, I'll see you next Tuesday or something.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, yeah, I personally just think it's about persecution, because that makes sense in the context. It's not about the timing of when he'll return. But yeah, I mean, so those are 3 verses that skeptics often cite to say that Jesus has been a prophet. But yeah, I guess that's, I definitely have a lot more prepared, but I think we're out of time.
Yeah, we're
But yeah,
pretty out of time.
unless there's any closing thoughts. Questions?
All right, well,
comments?
it's good stuff.
Alrighty.
Yeah, great job,
Yeah.
Ashton. It's the first
Yeah.
time we've covered this as a topic, but it is a
Exactly.
common objection. It's really
Yeah.
Mhm.
fits in well.